Oh shit! Oh my god! I thought we were just
push the button.
Oh my god!
Clipped around your ear, one of those ones.
Oh, I thought this was like
there was a little pre-conversation.
Yeah.
But you know,
that's why he tries to get you.
Any opportunity?
Yeah, right. Oh my god!
Guards down. Say something.
Just pounce.
Say something vulnerable. Like,
we're recording. We're live. We got all of it. It's like the Access Hollywood tapes.
Oh yeah. Right. Hopefully not as incriminating, but soon.
Well, hopefully you've. I don't know.
I don't know.
what have you been up to?
What have you been up to?
I have not grabbed anyone.
What a fucking shame. More's the pity. Tran Lam, how are you, my friend? You good?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, we're good. It's such a great privilege to have you in for a chat. Yeah, for anyone who's been following the podcast, we were meant to have we did have Tran on back in March, and then the world fell away, and it just kind of became. We're listening back to it, it's like doesn't make as much sense anymore. So we thought rather than try to make sense of something that was done in a time that is now just so wistfully off in the distance, we would bring you back and have a chat.
I think we had
a new
camera
chat.
Was like a phone taped to a broomstick or something as well. It was pretty low key. Tip-wise.
A phone taped to a broomstick, leaning precariously against the wall. Well, we've come up a little bit. There's two lights here, and there's a camera over there, and there's a whole table.
It's so fancy now.
Well, and we've relocated to a toilet.
It's very merry.
But the best recording toilet in the world.
Yeah. We hope so. It doesn't sound too bad.
Yeah.
We can live stream this shit onto literally. That was what it's put in for. I've only used it once. Double J when I think You and I played here, and they live streamed it to radio. And you do it all through these things. They plugged it into their fancy gear. And
now there's just a bunch of cables hanging from the wall as far as us fucking technophobes are concerned.
Now it just makes the room untidy.
This is as good as we get. Anyway, we're talking a lot. Well, we're here to talk to you. So how's the last 6 months been? What's been happening?
Yeah, interesting, like for everyone, an interesting time. Lost quite a bit of regular work, but so did a lot of people, so that's not unusual. And there have been a lot of things that have been in the conversation in the last 6 months, particularly about representation, diversity, inclusion. And so I've been trying to do a bit of work on that as in my lowly position as a freelancer with no money. But I hope I have helped give some people a platform to share their stories through food. Diversity in food media, which I started as an Instagram account to try and showcase. There are a lot of people doing really cool work, and they might not be as well known, or, I wanted to show that, that stereotype from Ratatouille, that like cranky old restaurant critic. Like, I feel like that's not the only representation that's happening in Australian food media. And let's shine the spotlight on people doing different things as well, and from really different backgrounds. So one of the people I featured is Chloe Sargent, who is she won an award for her reporting as an LGBTQ plus journalist, but she also has a chronic illness, and she talked about how when you have a chronic illness and you're looking for recipes and they say that they're simple but they're not, there's like 12,000 ingredients, or you have to start the day before, it actually does people with a chronic illness a real disservice, because they're often in a state where they need to eat well, but they don't have the energy, they don't have the time. And it really made me think that a word like simple, if you use it incorrectly, it really can have consequences.
Yeah,
for
use
people.
it as a marketing term as opposed to its actual definition.
Yeah, and so one thing she's doing is trying to start a website of recipes that are actually truly simple. So if you do have a chronic illness, you can make these things and keep yourself as well as possible, but not spend 3 days on one dish because you don't have that time.
I always find the differentiation between simple, you're right, you're bang on in the fact that, people use throw terms around very, very easily. But simple either refers to amount of ingredients or technique. Very rarely both. There's this dividing line. It's either simple amount of ingredients or there's a simple amount of technique. It's very rarely the both. 3 ingredients and it's fucking simple to put together. It just doesn't happen. It's an interesting thing. Where did you, was this contact with this person like the number one way you got thinking about this idea of people who aren't being represented well in the food space?
Actually, it started with a conversation with Andrew Levins, who I think you guys would know because he's
on the podcast next week.
Oh, awesome. He's like Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation with Levins. And I actually had rung him about something totally different, but this was after the George Floyd, the tragic death of George Floyd and all the protests, like the Black Lives Matter protests that happened. And he was quite upset about how, in Australian food media, it's quite difficult, especially after COVID or during COVID, because it's still going. A lot of media outlets, their budgets either shrank or became non-existent. So if we wanted to push for representation in food media, and we couldn't just go to an editor and say, here are 10 really awesome writers, you should be commissioning them, you should be like publishing their point of view, because no one had money. So we were just thinking, how can we actually change this? How can we give a platform to people from different backgrounds whose voices should be heard on the topic of food? And Levins talked about how he wanted to like mentor people coming up and give them opportunities.
In food writing.
Yeah, that's right.
Journalism.
That's right. Yeah, and then I kind of started thinking about, well, what can I do? And so the Instagram account, the Diversity in Food Media Instagram account, I started because I thought, look, I care more about actually getting stuff done than seeming like you're doing the right thing. I just think just do something. If you don't have money, what can you do without money, right? I'm not an editor. I can't publish people. I'm just a freelance journalist. But Instagram is cheap, anyone can get a free account. And if I start profiling people on Instagram, then maybe some editors will follow that account. That doesn't cost them anything. That's pretty easy. It's just a follow, right? And maybe other people will follow them. And maybe someone who does have a budget can say, hey, I like what you're doing. I want to publish your work. I want to find out more. So if I can help put people on the radar, and one of the people I did feature, her name's Rushani Eppa, and she runs something called Culinary magazine, which is like colour, like person of colour, and then Nary, Nary, which is a publication she put together to try and like throw the spotlight on. I think her first profile was on an Indigenous chef from the National Indigenous Culinary Institute. And I did a little Q&A on her, and then I found out she actually got a bit of work out of being featured on that. So
great.
Just being able to put people, in the spotlight. I know it's not big, it's not Vanity Fair, it's just like a little Instagram account, but if,
it's a step though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a step.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then out of that was the idea for the book, which is New Voices on Food, which in July I had the idea for the book, and then I went to the guys from Some Kind, who you guys would know because they published the P&V book. And their model is really good because it's really community-minded and it's really accessible and makes things possible. And so they started out in Geelong trying to help out restaurants that were affected by the lockdown back in March. So it started with 2 Geelong restaurants. And the idea, as you would know, is let's try and pre-sale a book about the local restaurant. If 100 people pre-order it, we can afford to print it.
Okay.
If not enough people do, it becomes a donation to the restaurant. And since then, they've done books on Lincoln Filling Station, Esther, Leho Fork, Pippet. I think everything they've put up has ended up being published because you only need 100 people. That's not too many. Like that's really possible.
It's fine. Yeah.
And the restaurant's community sort of they bring that to the table quite easily, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
There's some legitimate fucking cookbooks haven't sold that many. I'm sure if we asked the head of Murdoch Press, they'd be just be like, oh, don't tell me. Don't talk to me.
Yeah, so anyway, I went to these guys and said, I'd really love to do a book where we like publish like 10 different, people from diverse backgrounds, either maybe their food photography or their writing or maybe their illustrations. So that happened in July. In August, we opened it up for submissions and I used that Instagram account to spread the word. And September we closed. That was the deadline. And in September, I sifted through many.
How many did you get? You were looking for 10, yeah?
I only needed 10.
And you
we got we probably got enough
13.
to publish. Well, we probably got enough.
Difficult.
We got enough to publish like 13 books, you know.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and I read every single one. I replied to every single person. I stayed up till 3 a.m. so many times just because I knew that if you're sending this piece of work that's really personal to you, you want someone to reply to you straight away and go, hey, we got it. We've read it. We'll let you know if it's going to be included or not. And the good and bad thing in that we could only publish 10 was there's so many that I really wished we could have fit in. So then I worked with SBS Food, the managing editor, Farah, who was really awesome. And she said, look, I'll publish some of these as well. So then...
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, so I think maybe 10 or 12 pieces. A lot of them from first-time writers. She's going to publish on her website. She's going to pay them. So I feel really inspired that the feedback we got, some people sent us emails saying, oh, you know, I've never done anything like this before. Here's my piece of writing. And some people had only been writing for a very short amount of time. So one of the people we ended up featuring, her name's Roisin Call. She's only been writing for like 6 months. She's ended up doing 3 cookbooks in lockdown. So I don't know if you know her story. She's really awesome.
No.
So she was a chef at various Melbourne restaurants such as Lee Ho Fook. She had just finished she was working at Dinner by Heston and then went into administration at the start of the year. Yeah. And then...
That's a big ouch.
Yeah. And then at the same time, I think George Columbaris's restaurant empire collapsed. And then she was like, oh my God, like, you know, for a long time, a lot of people have thought, you know, hospitality is an industry a lot of people can turn to get some work, you know. It's very flexible in that way. And she thought, I don't know if I can do that anymore. Like, where are the jobs? And she had actually planned to move to London, and then the pandemic happened. And then she had actually been in India to help organise her sister's wedding. And she was like, oh my God, I have to come back to Australia. She was in quarantine for 2 weeks. And in that time, she started posting all she calls Chinese-ish dishes that she cooked. And she's of like mixed Asian heritage. And she just got all this feedback of like, oh, you know, how do you do this? And can you give us tips on this? And she realised there was a strong appetite for how to cook Chinese food with respect to how it should be done. Mm-hmm. So she put together this cookbook in isolation with her friend, an illustrator, Joanne, and she did it totally in lockdown. So she was taking the shots on her iPhone in like weird, uncomfortable angles to make sure each, you know, plate or piece of food was, you know, in focus.
Yeah.
And she just did it because she was an unemployed chef. And then it ended up getting like a lot of coverage. So I think it was on The Guardian. It was nominated for like a Time Out award. It was in Broadsheet. I ended up interviewing her for an SBS food story. And the bit I always found really moving is that she got all this feedback from people from Ireland, from Malaysia, people from around the world, you know, telling her, oh, you know, I made your chili oil, or I'm like a senior citizen, but, you know, making the dumplings helped me with my finger movements, or just checking in on them and being like, hey, are you guys okay? Because I know you're unemployed and there's a pandemic on. And it's so amazing that something that they self-published got such strong feedback from around the world.
The beauty of food, like it's how it opens up doors so unequivocally.
Yeah, so she ended up doing 2 other isolation cookbooks, and she submitted a piece for the book about how she eventually came to embrace the beige food that she found in Australia. Which, you know, coming
Sausals.
from
Sausal rolls.
Fucking Weet-Bix.
You know,
Weet-Bix and milk. There's nothing whiter than that breakfast, is there? Fucking wheat and milk. Fucking white people. What are we eating?
You know, because she came from Singapore, but then she talked about how she learned to love, you know, you know those Dixie cups, vanilla ice cream, like.
I had one like 2 weeks ago with Lena. Yeah, they're crap.
Yeah, right.
I used to love them.
Yes.
They're like little, like kind of like a little, they're like, what's it called? Like soft serve, but in a pot, in a little cardboard thing. And you buy them at like fucking 7-Elevens and they're petrol stations basically. But they're kind of like in the shape, they look like a little ice cream sundae kind of soft servey kind of thing. I remember them being excellent. And I was very disappointed recently.
And they're usually vanilla, right?
100% vanilla.
Yeah, very vanilla. But she talked about as she kind of...
Not good vanilla.
No, not fancy vanilla. But she talked about how she realised that like sprinkling a bit of Milo on it was, actually not that bad. So it's just a really nice piece about how she came to appreciate the food in Australia.
Do you? What was the common the common thread between the people that you chose? Was it their ability to tell the stories or their actual stories?
I think it had to have some kind of impact. And I found so many of these stories so moving. So one of the most moving ones was by a guy called Ahmad Hakim. And he grew up in Iran, in an area that his family had been in for 1,000 years. So they had 1,000 years of connection in this area, which back in the day was known as Mesopotamia, so one of the earliest ancient civilizations. And he had this really beautiful description of how they lived around this reeded lake, and his mother would take the scarf off her head and drag it through this lake and pull it up, and then the scarf would be full of little fish.
Wow.
And he had all these amazing descriptions of, frying soft dates in fresh buffalo butter. And, it was just magical reading about it. But I guess the hard turn that his life took was he advocated for education rights for an ethnic minority in Iran, and the officials do not like that. His friends got executed, and so he fled to Syria, and then he tried to make it to Jordan, and he hid under a bus to get to Jordan.
Wow.
And thank goodness he actually got accepted as a refugee and came to Australia. He ended up in Adelaide, where he became a chef. And just being able to read his story and the fact that I will be able to share his story, I just think is just so important, especially in Australia, where we really, our government really goes out of its way to silence refugees and the people that we've locked up in detention centres for so long. It's really hard for journalists to get out there. We don't hear from them, and we spend literally billions of dollars locking up people who have committed no crime. They just want a second chance at life, which they have, a right to. That's what my parents did. They fled, after the Vietnam War, and they were just really lucky that Australia at the time had a much more humanitarian refugee policy.
It's an insane thing to actually think about, isn't it? That the Australia of the late 1970s or mid to late 1970s has a more humane border approach than we do currently. And I know the world's changed a lot, and the conversations around people smuggling is a complicated one, but because no one wants to see people drowning at sea, and I don't have a solution. I don't know, but when people are arriving, as refugees, no matter how they're arriving, but there's such a small percentage people coming by boat, but it doesn't matter how they come, like having some sort of structure of humanity and acknowledgement of the fact that people are in need is so required. And it is really mind-boggling that we always, I think we play this trick on ourselves where we go, ours is the best version, the most humane version of history. Where we're living is the best. And it's very clear on a whole range of issues that we're currently up against that's not the case, and specifically in this one.
Yeah, especially the people in offshore detention centres, they've been there for more than 7 years, and New Zealand has over and over said, we will take these people, and our government says no, and they have no good reason for refusing New Zealand.
What do you put it down to? What do you think it is? Do you think it's just cold-heartedness or bureaucracy or just like ideology?
Well, I think it actually stems back to when John Howard refused to take the people on the Tampa boat back in the year 2000, 2001. And, you know, that whole speech of like, we decide who comes to Australia and the circumstances they come from. And he was going to lose the election that year, and then he ended up winning because of that. And I think, unfortunately, both major parties have seen it as a vote-winning strategy to be tough on refugees. But I think if you actually polled people and said, hey, do you think we should literally spend billions of dollars to lock up people in conditions that Amnesty International and the UN have condemned? Or should we actually let them contribute to society and let them come to Australia and, you know, let them do stuff, you know?
Yeah, the numbers in Australia are not even huge. I was reading the other day again, you know, with what's going on in America. It was like it was a thing on BBC about what's Donald Trump said about your country, and then you could put in your country and it would come up with like quotes of like, you know, have like a smiley. It was that little emoji, be like, this is his feeling for your country.
This is like, I wonder which ones the people just. That app just prescribes shithole country. Because I think he was just really broad with it. I think it was African countries in general he was talking about, Haiti, but specifically Zimbabwe's okay, but Nigeria, shithole.
You could go in a real rabbit hole with it. But the one that I put in Australia, and there's like, I think he loves Australia. He's like, there's no better friend to America than Australia. But it started off with the phone, like the famous or the infamous phone call when they were like, oh, let's just catch up on Obama said he's going to take these like 1,200 refugees that we've got off this on this island off of America. Trump's immediately like, that's the shittest deal I've ever heard. Why would we ever do that? And that was the sort of introduction to that world that's maybe about to be concluded in America. But yeah, it's a very strange concept to think that, you know, that idea of a country that's got its own history of unfairness, and then it's rebuilt or built a new version of itself anyway to on immigration and on, you know, trying to tempt people in the end. It's just, it gets to a point and they're just like, whoa, we've got enough here. Now we've got to, like, it's one of the most sparsely populated countries in the world. And I get it. It's a lot of it's desert, yada, yada, yada. But I mean,
there's a lot. Yeah. When we just drove, you know, up north last week, Kenny and I together, and you know, you do get a sense of the space of this country when you get in a car and start driving, and there is a lot of fucking room for a lot more people, and we can't make the reason why losing China's, you know, wheat imports to China, or our wheat exports to China, I should say, is terrifying. It's because we make too much fucking food for the people who live here. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Our population doesn't make sense for the land that we have. Yeah. We really have.
And these towns and communities that'll just falter and fall away. I read something, it was interesting.
They're dying, bro.
But this one was specifically based around New Zealand. So sad. Like saying that, you know, New Zealand residents should have better protection and better rights to come to Australia. And then someone sort of raised the point of, well, New Zealand, you know, it's there for a reason. Although, like, not just nothing derogatory to New Zealand, but it's like, but the cream would just leave and come to Australia because they think that's where the money is. That's where we can really make the fortune.
The old brain drain.
Yeah, so it's like you've got to sort of have these things in place so that these places can survive. You know, I know that New Zealand's a very wide thing of that, but if you're talking about like rural towns, what's the one we stopped at the bakery and on the way back?
Bulahdelah,
and you're just like, people just must just get the fuck out of here. Like as soon as you're like 18, you just must get the fuck out of here.
Well, there's no more industry around there. You know, a lot of things have moved on, which is sad. But you know, I don't know. There's still the little communities that could. You know, and there's areas like there's some amazing areas especially through you know the food bowl regions of this country, which you know they're still producing food. They're still producing a lot, and you're right. There's not a lot of opportunity for. Or seemingly not so much opportunity for young Australians who are born here, and they kind of, I don't know. There's a sense when you were talking before around this the young man from Iran. I was like, becoming a chef in Adelaide must be just such a fucking huge privilege for him because he would know the difference between himself and his friends who lost their life. So just having another opportunity to have another life and choosing such a, you know, we would call a beautiful profession, but let's call it what it really is, a fucking brutal one. One that takes a lot of fucking effort and a lot of time and a lot of physical energy. I was thinking about that story and just the disparity between his experience and choosing this industry because he loves cooking and loves food and committing to it. And that's a really powerful moment, and especially powerful when you start kind of comparing it to where I know my own industry's gotten to in the last 5 years specifically, where there's there's a growing sense of dissatisfaction with the industry because the people who are in it, maybe they're not in it for it's bad incentives. It's about fucking MasterChef and being a celebrity chef and having a big Instagram following as opposed to turning up fucking 1 p.m. and shelling fucking peas for 3 hours. I just, the comparison between the two. It's interesting.
Did it affect you emotionally? Like in the past, Jake and I have worked with the refugee centre in Newtown and employed 20 odd people through there. And we spent a few days just meeting one person after the next person and sort of, no one's going to sort of spill the full beans on their entire journey, but it was so draining. You kind of walk out there just thinking who the fuck am I? What is my life? What a overprivileged, it's there's people telling these stories that they're literally just trying to stay alive, trying to convince people who really do not want to be convinced that they deserve this second chance. And it's it was so draining and sort of it's strangely inspiring, motivating to sort of to try and find other ways to make a difference. How has it impacted you lastingly? How do you feel?
Oh, I always think about how my parents, risked their lives in their 20s to, my dad tried to escape Vietnam 3 times, and the first time he failed and he was caught and he was thrown in a labor camp for 6 months. And he said, you just spend 6 months hungry because there's not enough food. There are too many people, so you can never sleep properly. And the third time, which was when he was successful, they were on this boat, and you had to escape on a tiny boat because if you did it on a big boat, it was really obvious what you were doing. So you had to make it seem like, I'm just going on a little boat ride for fun. And I remember him telling me that they were at sea for quite a few days, and then the petrol got into their drinking water, and then the boat itself got into really bad shape, and they wondered whether they would survive. And these Thai fishermen basically rescued them, even though they would have gotten in so much trouble if they should not have helped them, officially. But luckily, the only reason I'm here is because they showed some humanity and kindness and helped my dad and the other people on this boat. And then he ended up in this refugee camp in Thailand. And at the time, Thailand did not really want these refugees, but the UNHCR said, if we process these people really quickly, will you just let them stay at this refugee camp? And so that's why Thailand allowed these refugees. And my dad said that Australia came to him and said, do you have any relatives in Australia? And he said, no, I don't. So then they didn't take him. And then America asked him, I think America would only take you if you had a lot of money, which he didn't because he was a refugee who just fled.
American of them.
Yeah. And then Australia came back again and said, we will take you. And it sticks in my head so much. He said Australia was the most humanitarian country to approach his refugee camp.
How did that process work? Did you make applications to multiple countries, or would they have representatives come to these refugee camps? Or how does that process?
Yeah, I haven't asked him about the finer details, but I think it was a case of countries making overtures of whether they would take you or not. And I just think, like you said before, this is what, late 70s, Australia's the most humanitarian country.
How do your parents respond to the Australia of 2020?
Well, my dad votes Greens, which I know a lot of people's parents would probably not vote Green, right?
Yeah,
Mostly people's parents, they get older and they become more conservative.
That's the old story, yeah.
Yeah.
Start a young liberal and die an old conservative.
So, it's pretty sad considering, so Malcolm Fraser in the 70s, when he decided to take all these, as they were called, boat people from Vietnam, he knew that if this was put to a vote, 90% of people would not back him. But he believed in this conviction so much that he did it anyway. And luckily at the time, there was bipartisan support for it. So Liberal and Labor supported bringing these refugees to Australia. And unfortunately, now we have completely the opposite, where we have both major parties trying to be as tough on refugees as possible.
Yeah. It's a really sad state of affairs, isn't it? It's but I mean, within this horrible reality, you've managed to kind of pull out these beautiful stories. In the pulling out of them, was there a sense of responsibility to their stories that kind of you had a starting point obviously with Levins and the idea of this book and started to. But where did the journey take you as far as your relationship with these people and or this continuing journey? Is it deepened it, or are you kind of, my job's done, I've done enough, I don't have the time? Because I imagine this is quite engaging emotionally.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure what gets published is really representative. So, I went through a first edit and went back to them and said, are you happy with this? And it's also been good to see how certain stories have developed. So one of the stories in the book is told in the voice of Arabella Douglas, who is a First Nations woman from the northern New South Wales region. She runs an organisation called Curry Country. They don't call it cultural tourism. I think they call it cultural immersion, but it's about connecting people with Indigenous culture.
Amazing. Mm-hmm.
And they do things like river cruises, and they work a lot with chefs in the region. So Ben Devlin from Pipit, I think Josh Lewis from Fleet, they've worked with Christine Manfield supplying Indigenous ingredients. So I think maybe Pipit have used their emu eggs. And the story she tells is about the connection with the First Nations community in that area with the Chinese community, and how she wants to run a pop-up, an Indigenous-inspired pop-up at a local Chinese restaurant. And when I talked to her, she was in the very early stages of this. The idea of what if you took an emu egg but you made it like a century egg? Or what if you did something with soy sauce or oysters that's Indigenous and Chinese at the same time? So when we went to print, it was very early on in the process, but I think by the end of the year she will have staged these dinners at a restaurant called, I think it's Eastern Door in Kingscliff. So it's like a really cool reimagining of, that stereotype of, the regional Chinese restaurant, but bringing it into the future and reframing it in an Indigenous context. And I think that's pretty awesome.
It's super exciting. It's also really cool to see like two of the most marginalized groups of people, like you said, like historically the Chinese restaurant in town was a marker of some level of multiculturalism and also a marker of massive racism. Like the families that run those establishments, I'm sure the stories are just rife, especially when you get into more rural areas. I grew up in them. I kind of was firsthand at some of these, a lot of those experiences. But now those Chinese restaurants are as fucking Australian as the towns they're in. Like the Golden Century in Albion Park that I drove by, or near Jamboree. They're amazing little and they're pockets of community, but ultimately quite marginalised historically. And then you have the Indigenous community. They make so much sense. Whilst there was on the face of it, you go, Indigenous and Chinese don't get it, but actually they've got a huge connection and story and shared history that isn't immediately available on its face. It's the kind of the power of food to bring people and community and culture together is, once again shown.
I think Jake sort of touched on it earlier, but with what you've just gone through and you're still sort of on that journey, is a part of you looking forward to restaurant world getting some way back to normal, so there's sort of regular jobs, things happen, or is this a path that you see yourself on for some time that just sort of pursue it further and keep giving a voice to this food community that's never had a conduit to people's ears before?
Yeah, I would say, even before this, I was always aware that you should be trying to be inclusive anyway, and you should be trying to give voice to these stories. Especially with doing my podcast, I thought it was really important to literally hand the microphone to someone like Sharon Saloom from Almond Bar so that she can talk about, her family in Syria who are affected by the Syrian war, and her uncle got kidnapped by rebels and luckily was freed after they paid the ransom and then fled to Germany, where luckily they got asylum, I think that's really important because she has been involved with Cook for Syria for the last few years, that fundraising event to raise money for UNICEF and its work for children affected by the Syrian conflict. And, I think it's awesome that so many chefs have really backed that initiative. But to hear her talk about her family being affected, I think it just gives it a different dimension. I think it's why it's important to, give people a platform so they can tell their stories.
Yeah. I think there's a term that's bandied around in hospitality a lot. I feel like you might have cracked the egg here. I said to you last time, I bumped in on the street to Lee Tran, and I said to you, you're such a low-key boss. You're just going around getting fucking some of the coolest shit done, some of this exciting stuff and very powerful things, and you're so unassuming, and yet what you're putting together is so incredible. And one of the things it's just jumping out at me is, and I mentioned before around entitlement, but specifically around food media and the entitlement around the way the entire thing is structured. Like, well, do we really need to have another fucking story getting to the heart of what makes this ex-cook why? Like, then he's going to the underbelly of this cook's, journey to, it's like the majority of the people, like 95% of the people we read these fucking articles or these things about have nothing interesting to say, neither in their restaurant nor on a fucking podcast or in they don't have any
1 year abroad working with a 2 Michelin star restaurant.
I used to get pots thrown at me in a fucking 2 Michelin star restaurant. Yeah, I fucking smuggled out of Iran underneath a fucking bus, and I still love food. And I think what you're highlighting is a role, number one, of that food it maintains its connection to people as a narrative, as a way to thread the needle in a narrative. To kind of give it some structure. This is the lens through which we are going to investigate community and individuals and our role within the wider community and our responsibilities. But we're going to do it whilst talking about warming dates in fucking Buffalo Bar, which, by the way, sounds fucking so good.
It does, doesn't it?
I'm like, and this is proper cooking. This is do people really buy the Yotam Ottolenghi cookbooks because of the recipes or because of the way he talks about food and the way he kind of delivers it? I would say the way he delivers it. He has a turn of phrase and a way of speaking about his culture and his heritage and the way that food plays it, rather than just fucking putting fucking lamb with those, what are those little red things,
pomegranates
seeds. Again, another fucking pomegranate salad with fucking braised lamb. Like, he does that fucking recipe in most books. Good on him, different twist. But that's not why you buy a book from Ottolenghi, because he tells a story. And this is, I think, what you're unraveling here and unearthing is the tip of the iceberg in terms of people's experience and the way that food is a conduit to their story. It's not the end result. We're not trying to piece a narrative to the food. It's like, no, the food is how we get. It's really fucking amazing.
Which is kind of what Chef's Table does when they tell that story and then they have that, like, I don't know if they pan in or pan out, whatever it is, but it's like, and this entire life story like ended up in this dish.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, fuck off.
I'd rather I can't watch the last ones because of that, because it's so false. Because they're trying to create a narrative around the food, as opposed to, oh my God, well, this is still a part of my life and this is my life. Yeah. How do you feel about being the custodian of these people's stories to a degree?
I feel responsibility to be respectful and do them justice. I feel like really honored that I get the chance to tell some of these stories, which I find really moving. And I have to give credit to platforms like SBS Food that give me the chance to tell some of these stories. One that has really moved me recently is a chef called Uday Huja, who runs a restaurant in Queensland called 19 at the Star. And he grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in the 70s his family was the only Indian family around. And his dad was a city planner, and people would take out ads saying Indian go home about his dad, because his dad had really progressive ideas about pedestrianising the mall, which has since become like a really big landmark in that town. But they did not like this idea. And he said, so their family is, they believe in the Sikh religion, so they wear turbans. Mm-hmm. And Uday said every single day someone would knock the turban off his head, like it was like a racist attack. And his teachers all had to learn how to knot a turban because it just happened all the time.
Wow.
And he told this story with an optimistic note, because he said what happened is his dad became a 2-term elected mayor in that town. So that was like a big turnaround. And then Uday ended up cooking for Obama at his very first state dinner.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
In Australia? What?
No, so because he grew up in America and then
yes.
He moved to Australia, I think maybe about 10 years ago. Yeah, because the very first state dinner for President Obama in 2009 was for the Indian Prime Minister. Oh. So another chef that was working there rang up Uday and was like, hey, can you come help us cook for the Indian Prime Minister? Amazing. And he talked about what it was like being at the White House.
I think it's amazing when they do that. But I would have been like, if I was the Indian Prime Minister, I was like, I didn't come to America for fucking Indian food, motherfucker.
There's these well-done steaks I've been hearing about.
Yeah, exactly. With prime fucking rib and cheeseburgers. I didn't come over here for your take on my fucking cuisines. I always thought that's so funny. It's like, what, this is the worst version of this.
yeah. My mum does it way better.
Way better. Well, this is the best that the United States has to offer. Thanks, Obama.
Well, you know what is interesting? So I interviewed Uday, and he talked about making samosas and how awesome it was for President Obama to come through the kitchen and like actually be so engaged.
Just for a sly dart.
He was like asking them lots of questions and knew a lot about Indian food. But the interesting thing was, so the chef who was overseeing the dinner was Marcus Samuelson. And recently I heard an interview where he talked about this same dinner. And he said, what would always happen at the White House is no matter who the dinner was for, they would cook a French meal. And he was like, this makes no sense. Like, why are we doing this? And he said, if our first dinner is for the Indian Prime Minister, like, why don't we acknowledge who he is and where he's coming from and respect him as a guest? And so what they ended up doing was doing an Indian-inspired menu that actually had a lot of soul food roots.
Yeah, okay.
So I think they did like pumpkin pie, but with masala.
Okay,
and
cool.
He was like, because when I do that, I'm saying, I hear you, I'm listening to you, I'm responding to you.
Well, that's a super cool way to. Well, that's another way of showing the bonds between cultures.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult to actually tease out where one cuisine begins and another one ends, right? When you take them, like, it might be one thing to take French and Chinese and kind of go, right, well, the two, but when you do it geographically, you're like, well, that appears here and this appears there, and you're going to go, you know, when you've got pierogies in the middle of dumplings and then you've got, you know, like pike dumplings that are actually, you know, braised in milk or whatever, like, you kind of start seeing this overall on ravioli and blah, 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 like, you start seeing this trend, you're like, it's pretty much, food's very fucking global.
All I'm thinking now is of some sort of soul food samosa, and it just sounds fucking delicious.
It does.
Imagine a samosa fucking full of fucking brisket. Yes, please.
Well, to bring it back to Uday, he said something that really helped build bridges in his town, where he was like, you know, part of the only Indian family, is, you know, there's that great tradition of American barbecue. And what they would do is like a tandoori inspired chicken, and the neighbors they would smell it, and they would smell the spices, and they're like, what is this barbecued chicken? And people would always come over and they wanted to try it because they're like, this version is better than like the barbecued chicken that we make. And I thought that was a nice way that food has ended up being a way to connect culturally for him. But you know what's interesting about the fact that originally it was always French food at these presidential dinners? I think it is worth asking, why do we assume that French food would be the best food, or like the highest form of culinary respect is to cook French food? And I think hopefully with all these conversations about diversity and representation, we're kind of valuing other techniques.
I would answer playing devil's advocate to that question. I think that there's and it's very easily shot down. I'm not defending this position, but I think the easy answer is the level of technique and the hierarchies that they'd established and their ties to actual physical luxury. So it's very difficult to take French cuisine at its very peak outside of the Plaza Athénée, because of what French cuisine represents to the world isn't just the fact that foie gras and and rich sauces on a plate. It's their commitment to luxury is like historically absolutely it's unachievable, and they kind of democratized it. It wasn't just for royal houses. If you were rich enough, you could go buy it, but it was always going to be tied back to that French because of the French cuisine. Because of, I think there's a very clear Western historical bent towards that. But when you look at technique and complexity, it's very easy to start talking about the myriad of Chinese techniques, Japanese. It's just incredibly high levels of technique. But, I don't know, there's obviously the clear distinction between, racism and historic kind of, but also I don't know, we live in a very Western dominated society, which it's very difficult to take that part and just call French food racist. Do you know?
I'm not saying it's racist.
But I think there is a logical argument. I just want to trace it down because it's one of those things that you've got to hold these two things side by side and kind of go. You ask the question of why is French food always seen like this, and when you take technique out of it, because technique's not the reason. What is it? Is it luxury? Is it just history? Yeah. What do we need to learn? Do we need to change it?
Part of it is that aspect of it's showing off, and it was about the cook more than the guest. French food does not lend itself well in any way to dietary. You know what I mean? It's like heaps of meat and heaps of dairy, all that stuff.
Back in the day when people could die of gout.
That's what I mean. Probably when people were saying that, they were getting, you got a plate of steamed broccoli and an apology. You know what I mean? It seemed very much more about look at me and what we can do, as opposed to anything to I suppose that maybe it was a sign of the kind of person Obama was, to sort of make it about the guest for a change. This is the new welcoming America. Yeah. And now I guarantee they probably got a well done steak for the last steak dinner.
Yeah, fucking ketchup.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to deny, because I think you have to be very skilled to pull off certain French culinary techniques. But I guess I want to tie this to a really interesting article that ran 2 years ago on the ABC website, which was written by Colin Ho and Nicholas Jordan, and they had this great quote from Dan Hong from Mr. Wong, and he said, basically to paraphrase, why is it that people will not pay more than $10 for dumplings, which are really hard to make, but they're happy to pay $30 for cacio e pepe, which is cheese, pasta, pepper, relatively easy to make. And I think people for a very long time have seen, and let's put it in massive quotation marks, ethnic food as only valued if it was cheap. It's often, you would see Chinese food in the cheap eats section of a food magazine or a food guide. And I think I once tried to make the Din Tai Fung dumplings, which I think are like 16 or 18 pleats, and it's so hard. Like try to make like 16 or 18 pleats on a dumpling. I completely stuffed it up.
Yeah, I think tiny.
Yeah, but I don't think people realize the level of work and technique that goes into something like that. They just go, oh well, dumplings are cheap, and I only value this food if it costs a certain amount.
So the media has a huge role to play in this. I think it's one thing we could talk about populations kind of evaluation or valuation on cuisines, but ultimately a lot of that value judgment is placed on it by the food media. I would argue that if I think it was a huge moment when people were writing about across the world, like Michelin star awarded to the yakitori joint and the ramen joints, and they were like, then there was a really clear decision made there. They were rewarding it to technique and to commitment to art of people who were elevating it. But it took a lot of people by surprise, especially the one Michelin star restaurants throughout France who had been, they're in white fucking tablecloth venues with, X and Y kind of commitment to luxury. And then all of a sudden there's someone in the fucking hawker market gets it for their noodles. And that's a powerful moment from Michelin, but I don't think it's been backed up very well. I think specifically around the cheap eats conversation. But what do you think that what role do you think that the media has in creating culture, or is the media's role being more about reflecting culture back and the way people use it? Like, where do you see the intersectionality between the role of media and in our current lives, and where should it go?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there is a responsibility to maybe talk more about the kind of technique that goes into a dumpling, and that it should be valued for the work that goes into it, and not just because, I only want to pay like $2 for this, or like I only want to pay this much for banh mi, or I only want to then these cuisines kind of get trapped by like their price point, which that doesn't happen to like Italian food or French food or other cuisines. So I think there's definitely a need to be more inclusive and not just, put French food right at the top. Like there are lots of different ways to evaluate food. And I think actually ages ago, I remember someone sending me an article where I think they got all these Chinese chefs to go to like Michelin starred restaurants in America, and they're like, these places aren't very good because they just had a different palate. Like what they thought was good food was actually very different. Yeah. And had different subtleties. And I think it's important that we don't just say a place can only be good because it has a white tablecloth. I mean, it's crazy that like Noma won't get 3 Michelin stars because they don't have white tablecloths. You know what I mean?
But they're in a position where they don't need the 3rd Michelin star to be to make money. A lot of the way that those Michelin venues are set up is they lose everything if they get 2 stars because they can no longer charge the money that it takes to pull off the luxury. And that 3rd star really is the thing that makes them any money. But look, but to dig in a bit more about the media, well, where do you see the food media kind of standards in Australia in terms of are we doing a good job of talking about any level of diversity here? Has it, because the SBS Food, for example, and Maeve O'Mara has been doing a powerful job of that for years, about talking about different stories, but very much not what I would call it's. Whilst I think it's very important, you wouldn't really rate those shows on the hierarchy of influence in food media and therefore kind of food culture, which has exploded over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I feel like there's been some really promising change or promising developments. I think one of the best articles printed this year is by Tran Lam at Gourmet Traveller, and she talked about all the Chinese restaurants that were affected by COVID, and just the crazy thing of for 30 years, Golden Century has been open every single day until 4 a.m. and then lockdown happened, and then it's like, whoa, this Sydney institution that would feed Chinese presidents, the doors were closed. like that she could tell the story of all these places in Chinatown with like a lot of humanity and history and cultural context. I thought that was really good. I feel like there's maybe a bit more reporting that, you know, I think there was like a good food story recently about maybe breakfast, like great places to have breakfast, and it wasn't all like eggs on toast. Like it was like a really wide range of, hey, here's where you can get like really good congee, here's where you can get like shakshuka. And I feel like perhaps this year there has been a bit more awareness. But I agree with you that it is a bit of a two-way street, because if, you know, when Colin Ho and Nicholas Jordan wrote that story where they asked about why is, you know, Asian food not valued as highly as like Italian or French food, they talked about restaurant owners where people would come in and they'd look at the price and they go like, well, I'm not going to pay this for noodles. Like, I don't think noodles should cost this much. And I think someone who's been really vocal about this is David Chang, you know, talking about, you know, when I make ramen, so much work goes into it, and why shouldn't that be reflected in the price? Whereas people don't really question if a bowl of pasta is $30 or $40, but people will only pay a certain amount for ramen, regardless of, you know, sometimes it takes a lot of labor.
Does that happen that happens in Japan as well, though, right? Like ramen's like not like the difference between ramen and sushi in Japan is like chalk and cheese, but the work that goes into both is like huge.
You know what's interesting is, so I read the David Chang memoir, Eat a Peach, which is so fascinating. So he was in Japan and he was really struck by how democratic the food culture is in Japan and lots of Asian countries, where you can eat really good food at a mall, you can eat really well at a train station, you go to a ramen joint and like CEOs kind of rub shoulders with students, like people from all different pay grades and demographics will like congregate in a ramen joint. But at the time, he was also working in New York at these really expensive, you know, restaurants with like multi-million-dollar fit outs and like menus that were in the hundreds of dollars. And he just could not relate to that, but he could relate to the food he was having in Asia. And then that kind of inspired what he did at Momofuku Noodle Bar. And I feel like what he did, and I'll be interested to know what you guys think, back in, 2004? And how that ended up inspiring a lot of chefs, a lot of young chefs around the world who like maybe would have gone on to work at a really expensive French restaurant to go, oh, actually, I want to run a place that's really fun that my friends can actually afford to go to, because they can't afford to go to a place that's like $300 a night. And I think that actually really changed our conception of what a good restaurant could be. Because in like Sydney, you know, maybe 15 years ago, a good restaurant that would get 3 hats or something would be like a really expensive French restaurant. And then David Chang does his thing, and then people like Dan Hong and Mitch Orr suddenly are doing like food that has a lot of fun but still has, you know, a respect for technique. And people from different age groups and pay grades are going there. It's not just like investment bankers.
Yeah.
And I feel like what you guys do with Mary's is kind of an extension of that.
Very much.
Yeah. I suppose it was you could look at that as the start of the decline of fine dining, you know, and whether like this whole COVID thing's accelerated that. And I think as far from my reckoning from David Chang, it's like he really sort of transcended cultures and you know through the fact that it's popular, like it became a part of popular culture, and therefore it was cool to go there. And it's like it was a restaurant, like looking at the photo, I've never been, Jakey's been to a couple of them in New York, but it's, you know, it didn't look like old school Asian restaurants of what you'd expected, and it's like the soundtracks was different. It was just, it really cut through so many sort of boundaries with so much fucking grace and ease that it just became so familiar and just took over. And it's, and guaranteed probably when he's working in these fancy French restaurants, he'd probably think it wasn't very delicious either. And it's like, you know, like these buttered noodles, you know, out of control.
I always find it interesting that he hasn't rolled out noodle bars everywhere. that his lasting impact, his biggest impact was Noodle Bar, and his lasting impact will be fancy restaurants. I never understood why Dave has done that. Like one of the biggest, it's the one that like he opens in Sydney in the fucking casino, and it's fucking aimed at three hats. He's opening in Las Vegas, and he's opening, you know, and the major venue is a Sayobo or fucking Cove style venue. I was very confused by the direction he's gone, because I agree with everything he said. One of the most powerful figures, I think Dave Chang will be seen as far more influential than Rene Redzepi. And right now we wouldn't say that, and a lot of people wouldn't say that, you know, especially a couple of years ago. But I think Rene's approach to life and approach to cuisine is so exclusionary and so difficult to afford as a punter. It's not democratic at all in terms of it's a kind of appeal and approach. And whilst, you know, and the world needs people like that, I'm sure. I don't, but, you know, I'm sure the world does, you know. But, you know, I think the power of what David Chang did is he did democratize it, and he did intertwine. He basically acknowledged his own belonging to that world, to the world, through lacing together his two narratives, which is a very American one and an Asian one. And he went, this is fucking who I am, and this is what I love from both. This is what I love this about. I love the democracy of America, and the fact that anyone, if they just work hard and get the, you know, pull themselves up by the bootstraps and get a 10-seat fucking place in the Lower East Side, can make a fucking an empire. And he led into that, but the culture, the music that he listened to is reflected back from a very Western lens. You know, his attitude is very non-fucking Asian. You know, especially in Japanese, like he's brash. You know, that's not Japanese at all, which is where he did a lot of his influential cooking. I know he's Korean, but, you know, he didn't do his cooking in Korea. And then, you know, so I think it is a powerful thing, but I can't reconcile it with the Dave Chang that I see today. The Dave Chang I hear on podcasts and stuff, I can still hear that person, the wrestling, you know, the insecurity, the kind of, but I don't see, like, the way he's rolled it out, like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I think that every restaurant, the sign of a great restaurant is that you should want one in every fucking city. And every city in the world would be better with the Momofuku noodle joint in it. Like, absolutely would be better. And I don't think you can claim that about the Co's of the world, because, you know, who's going to fucking care? 15 people a night, you know, like, it's not, doesn't have the same fucking hit about it as the lines around the corner for slurping noodles next to, like you said, another CEO. So I don't know, like, culturally it's a weird, I don't know if
you can take guesses at it. I mean, it's chef world, and whether the ego has things to do with it, whether it's just money being thrown at you to create opportunity has things. Sure, it's like little pieces of all these things. Because
sure, one day Dave Chang will be sitting in that hot little chair. Fucking get the fucker in here. He'll have a chat. He'll have a chat.
Well, I remember maybe he said on his podcast the reason why Co ended up being fine dining was because of the hot water situation, and they could only serve a very tiny amount of people. And I think the only way to make it viable was to make it.
Well, yeah, but then they moved Co to this fucking $2.5 million American fit out around the corner. Do you know, like, that's the kind of the Co of its inception in 2007 when they were launched, or 2008 when they launched. That's another powerful moment, because it was ragtag noodle fucking slingers cooking world-class cuisine, like proper cuisine, refined, you know, Korean, American, you know, whatever, his Dave Chang food. But yeah, I just always found that, I suppose the big thing is like, why is that luxury side of things the world that he chased down, when his real fucking power was all about, like, yeah, democratizing and bringing a new way. Like, that was what inspired most chefs that I know. And, you know, sambar to a degree, but, you know, I think it was, yeah, I don't know, the noodle bar thing. Everyone wants to own a noodle bar. Everyone wants to pretend they want to own a Co. No one wants to fucking work and own a Co. That doesn't make any fucking money. Everyone wants to own a fucking noodle bar, trust me, because that's the way he afforded everything.
Yeah.
I have to say, even though like a place like Momofuku Siebo, it might be a place I can only go to once a year, because you just have to save up. When I go, it's bloody amazing, and I do not regret it. And I think Paul Carmichael's cooking is
fuck.
Insanely
I'm not taking a moment
good.
away from the people who commit their fucking time and energy to those venues at all. I just find it intriguing that the person who started that's not where he started. You know, like, how his track took him from noodles to fucking fancy restaurants and rolling those out? That's just the intriguing question. I fucking love fancy fucking food, and I love Paul Carmichael. I think he's the best fucking cook in the country, hands down. But look, I wanted to just shoot back for a little bit because I want to fucking keep cracking into this media idea and pull some more out because are you frustrated? Has this process made you angry at the current media state, or hopeful because of some of the reception that you've had from the people at SBS Food? Has it, what emotion has it been eliciting you in, as a member of the media? Even though as you describe a lowly freelancer, you're still a part of it, and I think you'll have an opinion on it. But what emotionally has it been eliciting from you in relation to the state of food media today?
Yeah. You know what? It was really amazing when I started doing these things. I had a lot of people like Joanna Saville, Danny Valent, just come out and go like, anyway, I can help you out. Anyway, we can, if you want to pair me up with someone to mentor, I'm really, up for that. That awesome. Was really like so heartening and so encouraging. I hope that I don't become like the one person who ends up doing this, because I would want like a lot of people to be doing this. And also I know I'm like a completely fallible human being, and it'd be good if there were a lot of voices. I don't want it to just be my voice. And that's the reason why like the book, it's not me. It's like a lot of other people's voices who should be heard. And I'm really aware of like needing to pass the microphone and like to give them the moment in the spotlight and the exposure and the opportunities. I feel like there's been a lot more receptiveness to representation and inclusion, because I know in the past you would have some of these conversations and people were really defensive, people that I was maybe a little surprised by, and I just feel like people are a lot more accepting and a lot more open to this, which I think is good, because I think people don't change when they're defensive. And, something I'm very aware of is I don't want to say anything like, if you're a white journalist, you can't write about food. I think like anyone can.
Yeah, that's insanity. The fact that because you're not of the wrong skin color or the wrong gender, that you can't share an experience with another culture. Like that's really dangerous territory.
Yeah, I think almost anyone can write about almost anything as long as you do it with like cultural context, with respect, with open-mindedness. And I also don't want to perpetuate the idea that like, oh, you can only write about Vietnamese food if you're Vietnamese, because I think, again, that kind of like really traps people.
And it's just untrue. It's just fucking absolutely untrue. I can't remember, what's the English lady who's just like the fucking queen of Chinese.
Fuchsia Dunlop. Yeah.
You tell me that she's a fucking racist, or that she's speaking like that she's culturally appropriating things. Fuck off. No way. She's a champion of these things. And and if there was another voice there that was better than hers, and they were Chinese, like, cool, but they'd better be fucking better than her at talking about Chinese food, because otherwise it doesn't make fucking sense.
Yeah, I also think we need like a variety of people from different backgrounds and, different life experiences, not just people who've all gone to private school and all had like really affluent lives. Like I think it's important to have people of different life experiences as well.
Agreed. But they better be good as well, right?
Yeah.
But they better be good. Like,
yeah.
I think that's everyone should have the opportunity to be great.
Yeah. I think there is, though, an unfortunate, I guess, approach that I hope will change is if you look at something like the world's 50 best restaurant list, right? There's only one restaurant from mainland China on that list, and it's run by a French guy. And it's
that fucking thing is a piece of shit though. The 50 best is like the fact that Favicam with fucking 7 seats or some shit was in the top 14. It's like there's no way that you could get enough votes. Like just shut the fuck up. Like this is obvious. Which it showed itself in like, when was that? 2011 or 12 or something. It was like the moment that that idiosyncrasy the corruption of that was shown. I was like, this is just ridiculous.
Yeah, well, this restaurant, it's called Ultraviolet by Paul Paré. I think it only fits like 10 people. It's a tiny amount of people, right?
So what's it doing on the fucking list? It's ridiculous.
And there was a story in the New Yorker that said if apparently all the world's 50 best judges are going to this restaurant like they say they are, like something like 1 in 10 guests would have to be a world's 50 best restaurant judge. And I think if you have a list of the world's supposed best restaurants and the only restaurant from mainland China is run by a French guy with a European-style tasting menu format that cost $800, you have to question how that came to be. And I think for a long time there has been a value system that has put very expensive restaurants at the top. Often restaurants with like very expensive tasting menus, often restaurants with a European outlook. And you know what, maybe some of these restaurants are really great, but I think we need to ask, are they the only good restaurants, and what judgments are we making by saying they are the best ones?
What makes a good restaurant to you? Like, what makes not a good restaurant? What makes a great restaurant to Lee Tran Lam?
Wow, I think it depends on what it's trying to do, right? And if it does it, and if it is a place that, like, I think of, so there's a place in Newtown down the south end called Comico Foods, and it's run by a woman. Her background's Japanese. I think her name is pronounced Yu Ozone, and she had all these different allergies. So she couldn't have dairy, she couldn't have egg, she couldn't have wheat, and she found it really upsetting that she couldn't go out with her husband and enjoy the same food. So she started cooking all this like vegan, gluten-free food, and she wanted to make it, but she wanted to make it really good so that her husband would enjoy it too. And then so she's opened this cafe called Comico Foods. Everything's vegan and gluten-free. She grinds the organic rice flour herself to make sure it's not contaminated. So she really wants to make it inclusive for anyone. You know, if you have an allergy, you can come to this place. Like, so the sponges that touch anything with nuts, they're kept in a certain place, so there's no like cross-contamination. And because it's so inclusive, I think she made these sourdough donuts for her friend's son who was like, he was allergic to everything, like allergic to seeds, nuts, dairy. It's like trying to make something that's delicious that can't include any of those things is really bloody hard.
It's very difficult.
Yeah. And this
is why those children used to die, because people were lazy.
Yeah. So she spent...
I'm just glad there's someone in the world who's making food for them.
So she spent a long time trying to make these sourdough donuts, and they're actually really good. And all these people can try them because, if you have these allergies, it's totally fine to have this food. And I feel like, you know what, that is not going to be compared to like a 3 Michelin-starred place, but the fact that she goes to all that trouble to make these people feel welcome. Like, people have cried eating her donuts because they were like, I never thought I could eat a donut because of all my allergies, and I can eat your donut. Like, I think that is an amazing, that it exists, that she goes to all that hard work. She went to she flew to Japan to learn how to make rice bread because it's like a really good gluten-free substitute. Like, the length she's gone to, but she's probably not going to win a bunch of awards.
Why do you think that profiles of people like this lady aren't larger in the food community? And when I say the food community, like, you know, the name chefs, the people get name dropped, you know, and the cool venues. Like, why is that? Why don't we hear more of these stories that I think are far more legitimate than a $2 million fit out by the latest the latest Maryvale rollout? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think for a long time maybe exclusivity and expense have been the way we've assessed whether a restaurant is good enough, like whether a restaurant is supposedly good. You know, I mean, you look at a lot of these places that win these awards, and they may be great, but they often do have like $300 menus. Like, when is the last time a place with a $30 menu has ever won any of these awards? And I hope, like, I've written about her a few times, and I hope that by making the conversation more inclusive, that we recognise the hard work of someone like her even though she's charging, you know, maybe $6 for a donut, she's not a pastry chef at a Michelin-starred restaurant that has like a dessert that costs $60.
Yeah.
You know, so hopefully by widening the conversation and widening the way we frame stuff, we can recognize people of you know, all these different backgrounds.
People speaking out like yourself and chefs. Like, I mean, Sydney loves jumping on the next coolest thing. Like, everyone seems to miraculously love the same thing at the same time. It's quite amazing.
Well, I think it's incredible. Like, just when you talk about widening the lens, you know, and inclusivity, there's something that strikes me is like actually widening the lens to what's interesting, because I find that the really narrow approach that is kind of the paint by numbers, this is what's going to make you a successful named chef. You get a good write-up from Terry Durack and you don't get fucking burnt to pieces by fucking Mark Lethley, John Lethley, and you know, like if you manage to hurt all these things and you get 15,000 followers on fucking Instagram because you've got your Instagram fucking photo fucking shit sorted, and you can tell a story via like social media, that you've kind of got a little place in the club, but it's fucking boring. Like the majority of the pathways to that and the stories of these people that actually get to life like that is fucking pretty boring. And if they're not, let's assume they've actually got a really great story, that they're not boring people, but they're not fucking telling that story. Very rarely are people willing to tell the story that actually got them there, that's actually fucking pushing them through. And, you know, I don't know, like it seems that you have to get right to the top, like Ben Shrewy, to tell those stories for anyone to be interested in your actual fucking arrival story. You know, what do they call it in the fucking cartoons? Your
origin story.
You know, you get that when you get to that point. But in all honesty, like that's the most interesting part of Ben Shrewy. And we all have an origin story. And I think you're telling these origin stories for these people who may not be so lauded, you know, in the culinary world yet. But I'd far more like to read about and have these, you know, these moments shared with me than, you know, someone fucking deboning a fucking, you know, bluefin tuna in their fucking $2 million kitchen. Like, fuck that. It's boring. Anyone can do that if you just have enough money. Not everyone can fucking have the tenacity and the vision and the bravery and courage to hide under a bus or get on a fucking boat with your fucking family, or, you know, like that, and then arrive here, or, you know, or grow up in any sort of grow up in First Nations Indigenous person and overcome the, you know, the struggles that may present. So yeah, it's a really powerful lens shot light you're shining on. I think
take the years. It must have taken that woman years to figure out these recipes, and to a point where, one, she was satisfied, and two, where I don't know if it was her idea. It sounds like the person probably had to get convinced that you should open a restaurant. Like, people would pay for this. You're like, really? 100% people would pay for this food.
Yeah, it took her a really long time.
Yeah, such a long journey.
Yeah, she acknowledged, like, try to bake something without eggs, without dairy, without nuts, without seeds.
All the other things you've tried.
I would never do that.
Yeah.
It's fucking crap.
Yeah.
Whenever I bake, which is never and always terrible, I've always used those things, and I always will. It's pretty amazing that the tenacity that people show to pull something off.
Yeah, like it's through trial and error. Without, I mean, I'm making assumptions, but I imagine it's hard to sort of procure the scientific information about how to replace this specific reaction between these ingredients. It's literally just like finding something that you think's quite like it, and just trial and error until it's sort of, you get somewhere where the texture is okay. I can live with that.
But the reason, like the germination of where that little plant has grown from, like, of wanting to be of service to somebody else, you know, of wanting to feed back to something, not just feed someone's stomach, but, you know, when people cry over food like that, especially people like, you know, you hear a lot with vegans who've actually had a meal cooked for them that's not just taking the fucking protein out of a dish. You know, it's not, you know, like it's actually been specifically presented, and they feel very humbled by that and just so grateful that someone's put any energy into thinking about their meal. I think that's the real power of the story. You know, like it's Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Look, we've been chatting a while. It's so lovely to see you.
Oh,
it's so lovely to see you with a smile after all this fucking noise of the last 6 months. And to be able to come back and have a chat with you and just know that the last 6 months has not been fucking Netflix for you.
Yeah. I've watched a little bit of Netflix.
Yeah, we all have.
Yeah, but thank you. I mean, thank you for giving me this platform to talk about it, because I'm also aware that I don't get to talk about any of these things or write about these things unless someone gives me a platform. So I'm very appreciative of those available spaces.
On that note, because we touched on it, I think, before Jakey hit record, so this book you've been talking about is coming out soon.
Yeah.
So is there any information on that?
Yeah, where do we get it? Where can people buy it?
Okay, so it is called New Voices on Food, and it's printed by Some Kind Press.
I'll pop the links in the bar thing as well.
Yes. So you can order it from the Some Kind website.
Okay.
And it's not that expensive. It's only like $22 plus whatever postage is. So it's like somekindpress.com/products/new voices on food. But you can just look up Some Kind Press.
Yeah, and I'll stick it in the bios, and we'll share it on Instagram when we put up the episode. But look, I really can't thank you enough for being here with us and for once again like causing a conversation that's really important. It's so important, and I don't think we've covered off even the first mouthful of this fucking elephant that needs to get chewed by this whole industry. And thanks so much.
No, thank you.
Tran Lam.
Thank you. It's been awesome to chat to you guys.
All right, talk soon.